Alright, so I'm trying to get used to not literally pausing as soon as I open my mouth to record something. But having said that, I'm going to be recording my own reading of one of my own works. This is just a short starter for a role play that I wrote out. I've gotten pretty good feedback about it, so I think I'm going to just read it out and see how you guys enjoy it. See if anybody ever actually listens to it or not. And then if they do, I can maybe add more to it or just read some of my other stories. I've got probably 10 or 15 stories that I can read. So here we go. I'm gonna go ahead and start. It was heard in the distance, washing over the valley in bass-field notes, punctuated by frenzied screams of those less tamed. Of course, to be a necromancer, it was to exert one's will over the dead, a will so powerful it could reanimate them and power their movements. What happened when the necromancer lost his mind? When the perfectly ordered and structured mind began to find itself in chaos and disorder? Well, the living were soon to find out. Their fragile bodies would be turned into corpses walking on their own world, trampling their crops and slowly becoming perfectly absent. The opposite of chaos is not order, it is absence, for nothing cannot be chaotic. Absence is the opposite of all things. The necromancer stopped caring so very long ago. He barely remembered the reason for even becoming this abomination. All he knew is that he had such a thirst for life, to consume every tiny piece of it, that he had thrown his own mind into chaos and disorder. It was the most pleasurable agony he'd ever felt, the tinkling of darkness dancing across his mind like fingers brushing the void that existed there. He floated above his army of different cadavers. Those with flesh made the front lines, those without represented everything else. Even dead plants joined him, his consciousness flung out and latching on to those around him, spread thin until it snapped 1,000 times, until it was 1,000 times greater than anything else. The living made an impressive show. His army hadn't been quick to arrive. Their slow and inevitable walk took months, perhaps years even. Unlike most necromancers, he wandered into the light with abandon. What did he have to fear from the blistering sun? Nothing. Not when they had the same goals. He believed so very firmly that existence wished to cease. Life wanted death. It craved the end. He was simply providing what it craved, like a mother feeding its children. And thus the pikes and flames of the living glistened and glowed in his path. 100,000 strong soldiers and mages from every kingdom united behind one banner, a single flower amidst a dead branch. He loved it, really. The symbol itself was gorgeous. It moved him. Unfortunately, it moved him towards it, inevitably drawing him in until the armies clashed. His floating form, skeletal where it could be, and ethereal where it couldn't, rose even higher as arrows filled with holy magic pierced him. Horror filled their archers, as each arrow struck true and did nothing to dampen his darkness or his power. Simply a nuisance, something he could decide he wished not to exist. Each arrow fizzled away, taken by the darkness and absence that he promised all things. The pikes shredded his cadavers, piercing 3 or 4 rows deep before being lost to the weight of their targets. Of course, piercing a being that was animated by pure willpower was ineffective. Fireballs fell amongst his cadavers, lighting them up and combusting some of them violently. Craters filled the battlefield as his soldiers began to explode in groups and scattered their remains into grand displays of flesh, fountains of beautiful chaos. He watched with a small smile growing on his skeletal face. It was art, beautiful in all of its destruction. The chanting that he'd up till now been ignoring finally culminated in a great bolt of holy lightning, impressive in its power and desperation. He could taste the different gods on his tongue. each one giving their full power to their acolytes. Who was he to inspire such unity? It was breathtaking. The entire experience was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. But all too soon, the bolt ended and he was flush with newfound power. Each god that had attacked him now fought a war in their own minds for supremacy. Order attempted to rule over his chaos. The connection was all he needed to see them. Their metaphorical temples were falling as his gnawing chaos slowly ate away at them, claiming their power for himself. It was simply what they needed. Absence, an end to struggling and fighting, no more grudges to hold in eternity, no more acolytes to bless, no more worrying about their worship. Blessed silence answered him eventually, as each god succumbed in their own time, lending their raw power to his cause. The acolytes began chanting again, this time with the aid of magi and archmagi. He glanced at the growing mass of magic wielders, and smiled when the warlocks and the witches joined in, followed by the shaman and sorcerers. The unity was impressive. Every voice intoned the same notes, desperately holding the incantation for longer than any had before. It was life. They were not beseeching a god, but a force. He waited, turning his attention away from them in boredom. Soon he would have entertainment aplenty, and then, not long after, he would have peace. His cadavers had all been ruined, scattered amongst the battlefield. A frown crossed his face as he split his mind another million ways. It was simple now, to spread himself further and further. He separated muscle from bone, forming both into their own beings, and rising a new army. Half of them were flesh only, muscle attached to nothing except more muscles, ligaments swinging wildly like trillions of whips, gripping and jerking armor and weapons from the living while they were pummeled by the formless muscles. Sorry. Ligaments swinging wildly like trillions of whips, gripping and jerking armor and weapons from the living while they were pummeled by the formless muscles. Destroyed and smashing to paste, only to be forced to surrender and conglomerate into the mass of flesh that had killed them. The bones, that was his favorite by far to create. He didn't bother making human shapes. Not any shapes life could conceive of. The living lacked imagination, and thus couldn't quite understand the amalgamation of bone he used. It would never be still. The cracking and splitting noises brought a cacophony of noise with it. Acting as a grinder, it made its way deeper into his army, into the living army, shredding away trolls and orcs like they were dust, which they soon were. The pure white bones soon became crimson, and with the blood of the dead. Nothing remained still for long. Not while he watched on sadly. He hated their struggle. It was painful to watch them not understand that it was for their own good. The end was necessary. It would be so quiet afterwards, and he could finally sleep. His attention was suddenly stolen from him by a great white, green, then blue bolt of lightning striking in the center of the magic wielders. Their chanting suddenly cut off as they all simultaneously waited for whatever they had summoned to take form and fight this grand absence. Cries of shock came from the group, and the grand necromancer flew over to investigate. He looked at the small woman without comprehension for a long moment, until he felt his mind crack, truly crack. Agony flooding him without end, pain that he'd buried beneath chaos and blood, pain that he'd sought to rid the world of. Did they not understand this was his gift to them, the absence? Parts of him began to recognize her, parts he had hidden deeper and deeper than any of the others, pieces of a past life, thousands of years ago, when he smiled as a man, weak and pathetic, unable to stop theft, unable to save anyone, unable to promise them peace. His silver armor gleamed on his shoulders then, a paladin, a battle acolyte of one god or another. He couldn't remember which, and it mattered so very little to him. When he remembered for sure was agony, heart-stopping pain that worked its way through him, coursing through every fiber of his being. His wife had died while he was fighting some other god, or something equally pointless. His metal shell had protected him without so much as a scratch, while his wife had been raped by another god's acolyte, then burned at the stake. He had returned to ashes and dust left of his home, and the half-charred remnants of his wife. His dreams had been tainted with her agonies. Every pain she went through, and some invented by his own twisted reality. He took off his armor and never wore it again, wandering the countryside as a mad beggar for years until yet another god spoke to him. Promises of power and revenge were heaped into his mind, nearly overloading it, but the promise of power was a true one. The only truth he cared about was power. He started with a need to wipe away the memory of his wife and the depraved things that had been done to her, but it would not leave him no matter how much he gained. Finally, he found it. Absence. The blackness that wasn't. It was free of gods, free of promises and pains. It was beautiful, and it had been inside of him the entire time, deeper and deeper than he could have reached without madness, doubled into infinity on himself until he found it. These memories flooded him as he floated to and fro, screaming into the darkness of his mind and wailing outside of it. His armies waited with his pain, the realization of what they had lost and the spark of what they could become. His hollow eyes couldn't leave her as liquid blackness sank down his face. He hadn't seen her face in so long. This beautiful thing that he had fought so very hard to remove. His hands tore at the shadowy tendrils that made up his hair, as his screams of agony went on and on, unabated by time. All living and unliving things stopped moving to witness his agony and the majesty of life. He slowly floated towards her, his hands outstretched towards her as she looked around in confusion. He could feel her power. It would rival his own if he could bear to fight her. Not her, though. Not this one thing. His skeletal, shadow-wreathed hand brushed her cheek as he wept continuously. He couldn't bear to see her like this. Not after so long. Not his beautiful lost one. He shot straight up into the air, not looking back at her. Higher and higher he flew until nothing but himself and the clouds remained. His children somehow broke free of his mind, wiggling away from him and scattering off to the north. He could feel their burgeoning awareness. His fractured mind had turned into 1,000 living, breathing children. It would come to be known as their victory, Light's Day, a day that every single race celebrated in unity. Wars were halted completely, and worst enemies would become greatest friends from sunrise until sunset. The world changed, and time moved on without him. Eventually, he became something of a legend, and was relegated to a powerful necromancer, and nothing more. At least, among the races he didn't touch. There were 2 new races from that day, from his own mind, beginning at an even 500 each. Both were hated by most other kingdoms, at first, seen as relics of the war and considered dangerous. In time, they came to be accepted and even thrived among other races for short stints of time, but always returned home to the north on Light's Day. They prayed to their god, one they worshipped with nothing but love, a being who gave them life and strength to resist all things that would come to torment them, a being who gave them a home and asked nothing in return, a being they prayed would return someday to see what wonders they had made in his name. They were inventors and craftsmen unlike the world had ever seen. Their numbers never wavered, although some died. Those who perished were reborn as new lives. The same species that had perished would come back, and their numbers would not waver. They could not reproduce, but they could love, feel anger, and lead fruitful and joyous lives. The first species were the Shade, humanoid, with thin bodies, intelligent beyond what most would consider possible. Their eyes retained their god's blessing, pools of shadow that seemed to burn like fire and occasionally would drip out into tears. They had no nails and lacked hair, but they could smile and sing beautifully. The second species was the Psi, strange insectoid race, with basically humanoid bodies made of chitin. Stronger and faster than almost anything before them, these creatures were renowned as frontline warriors and had defended their ancestral home for millennia. They were builders that could construct spiraling towers and magnificent palaces in weeks. Both species were together in near lockstep. The Shade would develop and plan weapons of war, defensive structures, and tactics, where the Psi were a near unstoppable force who could construct nearly anything in hours, if not minutes. Both groups called the Barrow their home, a massive city in the frozen north that no foreigners were allowed to enter. Their advanced Both groups called the Barrow their home, a massive city in the north that no foreigners were allowed to enter. Their advanced technologies and the method for their reproduction was kept a closely guarded secret, alongside their ever-growing and ever more advanced palace. They waited for their god to return. Every year, on the same day, they were silent and still for the entire day. Not a hair of the city moved, not even to defend themselves. Their faith was unshakable, and even the few gods that had risen up since the Light's Day were powerless when fighting against the citizens of the Barrow. And so it was that a millennia later, something fell from the heavens. Not over the Barrow, as they had expected, but further south, in the center of a bustling city that boasted citizens of all different races. Even those of the Barrow were welcome. It fell hard, its wings unable to hold it up or unwilling, crashing to the earth and destroying a shop in the process. The entire city fell silent as everyone that looked up had saw the same thing falling. A great dark bird that seemed to trail shadows, a thing eerily similar to a certain legend that died on that day so very long ago. When the dust settled, a young pale man with dark wings made of oily black feathers, reminiscent of a crow, lay there, unconscious and slowly bleeding shadowy wisps from the many wounds he'd sustained in his fall. Nothing major, but cuts and scratches were in abundance. Just as the city guard were beginning to clear the crowd and the panic was beginning to wane, 20 or so minutes after the fall, he opened his eyes and looked around frantically. Where any living creature except the Shade would have eyes, there was a single glowing dot surrounded by liquid shadow. The tiny pinprick of light searched erratically for any meaning to the sudden awareness, but exhaustion took him before any sense could be made. He was quickly transported to the College of Magi. They couldn't truly decide what to make of him. They pored over their tomes, and searched for steady hours, only to come up empty-handed. They ran test after test to determine at least what his attunement was, determining he was neither a creature of the light or the darkness. He was something none had ever heard of. There were rumors that he was the reborn necromancer, but everyone with any sense to them pointed out how the necromancer died, and he didn't even look human in the end. He was a shell of a man, skeletal and fleshless, without wings and wreathed in shadows. This thing couldn't be the necromancer. When he awoke, several days later, the Magi questioned him. Every school of magic's representative petitioned for a chance to question him, and one by one they were disappointed by his lack of knowledge and seeming amnesia. He repeated the same thing to each of them. He had no idea who he was or where he came from. He couldn't even remember falling. And that is the first story. I know it stops maybe a little bit at a cliffhanger, but let me know if you like it, and I hope you have a good day. All right.